Yo ho ho! Welcome back to another video. So today I'm going to be talking you through this lovely stack of horror novels right here. I've got some contemporary horror, I've got some 18th century horror, I have got some manga, so a good eclectic mix of novels to talk about today. Some of them I've read, some of which I haven't read, so bear with me when I'm talking through some of them because I might get them a little bit muddled up, but I'm going to try my best, so let's get into it. So the first book I have here is actually a bind up of two novels, and it's a collection called The Room of Mourning by William Sloane, and it has an introduction by your man himself. So both stories have cosmic horror elements to them, and the first one is about two college students who are on their way to meet up with one of their favourite professors, and they discover when they get there that he's been consumed by fire. And there's a mysterious woman there, and it sounds like it's like a murder mystery, sort of dark academia tale that's also cosmic horror. And the second story is about a scientist who has lost his wife, who returns to Maine to live a really kind of quiet life, and he makes a discovery that may not only threaten the town that he's living in, but may also threaten the world. So yeah, I just thought those stories sound completely different from each other. I'm really intrigued to check out this author and see if he's any good. Let me know if you've read any William Sloane and if I've got something to genuinely look forward to here. Next, I have The Monk by Matthew Lewis. This is one of my all-time favourite Gothic horror novels, and novels in general, and I'm so happy to finally have my own edition of it because when I read it I got it from the library, and I've just been meaning to pick up a copy for like the last 5 or 6 years, and I finally have it. And I think this covers gas. I just find it really, really amusing. So this is the story of the monk Ambrosio, who is living in a monastery in Madrid, and it's basically the story of his downfall, of how he succumbs to all the awful temptations and he commits atrocious crimes. And this is basically the quintessential Gothic horror novel. I would say to anyone who wants a true example of the genre, this is the book to pick up. And it's a difficult read because it is 18th century literature. It was very difficult for me to read at the time because it was my first deep dive into reading a book this old. It was a bit of a shock to the system with getting used to the use of language in it. And I feel like there was a lot that went over my head just because I was a bit overwhelmed reading it. However, I kind of want to reread it. I may not reread it in full, but I feel like every time I talk about this novel to people, I feel like I remember it less and less, and that's something that's sort of bothering me. So I have my own copy now. I'm going to be able to just dip into it if I need to, say if I need to talk about it in a future recommendations video or something like that. It's really one of the most kind of disturbing books that I've read so far. This guy was like in his early 20s when he wrote it, and it's crazy to think about that. I hate when you read books by people who are like in their late teens, early 20s, and you're just like, how are you able to write like this? How did you even come up with this in the first place? I hate people who are more successful than me, but anywho. So the next book is actually the reason why I'm wearing this shirt, which you can't even properly see, but it's, yeah. I am going to be reading It by Stephen King. I am trying to motivate myself at the moment to make this my mammoth read of 2022. It is over 1,000 pages, even though I feel like this edition is quite deceptive to the eye. It's got those really thin pages, so it looks like it's, I don't know, maybe 700 pages to me, but we all know how long it is. If you are not familiar with the story of It, it's a story that is set in 2 different time periods. It centers a group of children after one of their siblings goes missing, and they set out to find the reason why he went missing or any sort of clues about what happened to him. And they come across this evil being that basically feeds on their fear and is the reason why children have been going missing in this town for centuries. So as adults, they have to regroup and get back together in order to finally put an end to this. I feel like I'm very, very familiar with the story of this. I've seen the adaptations of it. I also have watched people review this and do vlogs of this, and I know some of the more seedier aspects of this book. I know some of the more disturbing parts of it, which I don't know if that's going to be good or bad for my overall reading experience of this when I get to it. There are, I suppose you can regard them as spoilers. Like there's certain things, like I know how this ends. I know how some of the characters are written in this compared to their film adaptations of them. So yeah, I feel like it might be a bit rough reading it because I always find that I struggle when I've seen like the film adaptations of King's work and then I go back to actually read the book for the first time. Like I really disliked The Shining. That's probably going to be shocking to people. I had the film so ingrained in my brain that it just completely ruined my reading experience of it. But I'm hoping that this will be different, especially since it's going to be such a time commitment for me. It usually takes me about a month to read books this size without reading anything else on the side. So we'll see. Next, I have a short story collection which I've already read. It is The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers. So this is one that I've been meaning to read for absolute years. People have been recommending it to me over and over and over again over the span of my channel. And I can say I finally read it. So going into this, I was a little bit apprehensive because I was thinking that it may be repetitive based on the loose plot that The King in Yellow is a book that when one reads it, they end up losing their mind. So I was thinking like, this is probably going to be really repetitive if that's the overall outcome for each of the stories, but I was completely wrong. There were some stories that really blew me away because I just didn't expect where they were going to go. There was quite a few slow burns, which I really appreciate when it comes to horror. I don't like immediate horror right off the top. I like when things are really slow and maybe even a little bit boring, and then all of a sudden out of nowhere something jumps up and gets you and you're just like, okay, I was not expecting that whatsoever. I was thinking this was like such a dull, boring story, and then all of a sudden it just got me. I really recommend this, especially if you're someone who's going through a bit of a reading slump. I have been going through an on and off reading slump for probably the last year, and I find that reading short story collections really helps because you don't really have to put in that much effort because you're reading a new story every like 15-20 pages or so, you know what I mean? So yeah, I'd definitely recommend this again if you want to read some more older horror works. Then I have a book that I picked up because I thought it was a classic and it turns out it's not. I just got confused by the blurb on the back. It was actually published a couple of years ago. It's Comemadre by Roque Laraki, and this is a novel that's set in two different time periods again. The first is 1907 in Buenos Aires, and it centers a doctor who's doing these really barbaric experiments on people. He's basically decapitating his patients and recording what they say for the 6 seconds that they're still alive afterwards. I'm not sure if it's using the data collected from that experiment, but I'm assuming so. But there's a modern day artist who basically makes himself into a piece of art. So this sounds like it's going to be like one of those kind of dark, satirical stories that might be more amusing than disturbing. The reason why I picked this up is because the plot really reminded me of those like early 2000s films, all those kind of like weird foreign films that came out at the time, where it's like all these kind of like mad sort of scientific experiments happening on patients. I feel like that's like a subgenre in horror that I really like because it really disturbs the living Jesus out of me. So yeah, I'm hoping that this is going to be really good. I will be getting back to you on my thoughts on this, and again, if any of you have read this, let me know. Next, I have another disturbing read that I read last year and I ended up really enjoying, but not for the reasons that I thought. It's Exquisite Corpse by Poppy Z. Bright. So I went into this thinking that this is just a serial killer story. It's probably going to be a little bit rough to read because it's from the perspective of a serial killer. And, you know, getting into that psyche is probably going to be a really rough read. To be honest, I came out of it just incredibly emotional. Like, it was a really emotional read for me, which probably sounds mad to some people, especially if you haven't read this. But there is a lot of very human moments within this that just completely took me off guard. The story follows Andrew Compton, who is an English serial killer. He's been convicted and he's in prison, and he ends up escaping, and he finds his way over to America, to New Orleans, specifically to the French Quarter. There he meets Jay, who is also a serial killer, and they end up teaming up together and finding their perfect victim and discussing the perfect killing. And it's just like this kind of weird bonding session. There's a huge focus on the discussion of the AIDS epidemic in this book. This is very much an LGBTQ plus book, and that was the aspect of this that I was not expecting. I feel like every single variation of what you could expect when suffering from an illness like that is very well depicted in this. But then there's other aspects to it which is really disturbing, where you've got characters who are like fetishizing it because they're so in love with the idea of death that really kind of like turns them on, the idea of them catching it themselves. And it's just like, it is a bit of a mind fuck of a book, if I'm going to be perfectly honest. It's one of those books that you just have to really sit with after you read it and think about it. And I don't know if I'd say I loved this, because I feel like it's a difficult book to say you love. But like, it definitely gave me a lot of food for thought. And there was moments, thankfully, of comedic relief, especially between the two serial killers. There are certain moments where they're being very judgmental of each other and their techniques and their rituals, so to speak, which is incredibly entertaining, and it was very much needed in certain parts of this book. Next, I have some contemporary horror. I've got The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. This is a book that I've been seeing doing the rounds for the last couple of years on Instagram and on BookTube, and I've just seen it so many times that I feel like I've just given in to buying it just because I keep seeing it everywhere. I don't really know that much about the plot. All I know is that it centers around a Native American man who went on some sort of hunting trip when he was younger. He starts having visions now and seeing other people who were on this trip with him have horrible things happen to them. And I'm not sure if it's like they're being haunted by whatever happened to them on this trip, or if they're cursed by something that they did, but it's something along the lines of that. And I just keep hearing that it's something that's quite disturbing. It's quite thought-provoking. I keep seeing people rate it 5 stars on Goodreads, and I just feel like it's something that I have to check out as a horror reader. Next, I have A Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay. So he's an author I've been meaning to read for absolute years now. And I did a little bit of research into a couple of his books. I was originally going to pick up The Cabin at the End of the World, Edge of the World, whatever it's called. And I decided, nah, that doesn't really sound like my cup of tea. And then I found this, because this is about possession. And I was like, yes. It doesn't matter what it's about. Like, as long as it's got possession in it, I'm probably going to enjoy it. So this is about a family who are kind of struggling, and they have 2 young daughters, and their eldest daughter, who's 14, starts having really bad outbursts, violent outbursts. She's just not behaving like she usually would. And they speculate that she's having some sort of mental health breakdown. But as her symptoms worsen, her father starts to actually believe that she's possessed by a demon. And this ultimately lands the family on a show called The Possession, which documents her supposed possession. And it's told from the perspective of the younger sister and what she remembers of this time in her life. And she's telling the story to a writer, and I'm assuming that they're working on some sort of book together. So I just think that sounds like a really cool modern twist on the possession genre, because it is a subgenre that can be incredibly repetitive naturally. So I'm just looking forward to this, and I'm hoping that it's not too modern though, if that makes sense. Like, I hate when reading contemporary horror and they reference like Facebook or Twitter and things like that. Technology, okay, but like when we start referencing websites, not so much okay in my books, but hopefully there's none of that. Or if it is, that it's tolerable. That's such a weird like pet peeve of mine, but yeah, there's one of my pet peeves. Then I have Count Magnus and Other Stories by M.R. James. So I am not the biggest fan of ghost stories, but I have been told time and time and time again to give some of his short stories a go. So I picked this up. I really know absolutely nothing about what the short stories entail, aside from the fact that they're probably supernatural related. I'm planning to read this probably more towards the autumnal time of the year, maybe like August, September, October, leading into, spooky season. I tend not to look up a lot of stuff about short story collections. I'll look up general reviews about them. I will look at star ratings, but I find that you're going to be really easily spoiled on a short story collection. So I'm so terrified of spoilers, especially for some of the stuff that I read, that I'm just pure ignorance going into it. I feel like I need to enjoy the haunting ghost subgenre a lot more than I actually do. I feel kind of bad that I'm not like a huge fan of it. I have 2 more short story collections. I've got The Dangers of Smoking in Bed and The Things That We Lost in the Fire by Mariana Enriquez. So all I know of these short stories is that The Things That We Lost in the Fire has been recommended to me multiple times over the last 2 or 3 years, I want to say, and that it centers around themes of addiction, poverty, womanhood, the struggles that women kind of go through in their lives, in relationships, etc. And all these stories are Gothic horror related. They have supernatural elements to them, and I'm assuming that the dangers of smoking in bed is the same, but I may be wrong. I'm hoping to get through both of these soon, and I'll be doing a dual review of them, and I'm really looking forward to it because I'm hoping that everyone's right and that I will really enjoy these stories. And now to get into the manga, which is all Junji Ito, of course. The first one that I have is Remina. So I ended up reading this last year, and I have to say I did ultimately end up agreeing with the reviews that I had seen beforehand. It really wasn't the best of his longer form stories. It was really underwhelming for me. I really disliked the ending. I disliked the pacing of the story. I thought the story itself was really interesting, and that's the reason why I got this, because it's cosmic horror. It's the story of a scientist who discovers a new planet in our solar system, and initially he's celebrated for its discovery, and he ends up naming the planet after his daughter Remina, and she becomes an overnight superstar. Everyone wants to know her, everyone is excited by her. And it's really more so the story of fans and obsession and making people famous for no real reason. There are some really interesting themes in this, and the artwork, as always, is phenomenal. There's a couple of panels that are just really haunting, but overall, I just hated the ending of the story. I felt like if it had ended like 10, 15, 20 pages earlier than it did, and we were left with more of a feeling of not knowing what actually happened, that would have been stronger. I felt like this was a bit too much Wizard of Oz, what's behind the curtain type of thing, and I just didn't really enjoy that element to it. And then finally, my last two books are more Junji Ito. I have two of his short story collections. I've got Shiver and I have Smashed. So again, I have been meaning to read more of his short stories. I feel like Junji Ito is much better when he's writing short stories, because his longer form works tend to fizzle out at the end, like I was just saying with Remina. I feel like he's a great ideas man. He has so many interesting concepts. With Shiver, I know that this tends to be people's more favoured collection, and I'm really interested to read it because there's certain stories in this that I have wanted to read for years. I know the fashion model story is in this. I know Greased is in it, which is one of his most like disgusting stories apparently. And then in Smashed, I think the story that I'm most excited to read finally is Earthbound. I know that's one that's really popular among his fans. But yeah, I think Junji Ito is great. I think he tends to write a lot about the theme of obsession, and I think he does it really well. And I'm assuming that there's going to be certain stories that revolve around that. Again, in these, I may be sometimes disappointed with the endings of his stories, but overall it's still an enjoyable experience reading his work. So yeah, dead excited to get into these, and again I'm hoping to do a dual review of them in the next month or two. So that's been my horror book haul. This is the first time I've done a genre only specific book haul. Let me know if you like this sort of thing, or if you just prefer in future it remaining a hodgepodge of different genres and all that kind of thing. As always, let me know your thoughts if you've read any of these books. I love hearing your reviews and your insights, and I feel like it definitely motivates me to pick up books a lot sooner than I initially would have if I hadn't read what you guys had to say about certain books. If you want to keep up with me outside of YouTube, you can pop on over to my Instagram. It's pretty much the only social media that I use on a regular basis. Sometimes I use my Twitter. Mostly I retweet important things and then I just like shit posts, and that's pretty much all I do over there. So it's a bit of a waste of time. But yeah, I tend to be a little bit more up to date on my Instagram if you want to see what I'm currently reading and all that kind of thing. Yeah, that's the place to be. Really, everywhere is a hellhole when I'm involved in it. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you're keeping well, and I will talk to you soon. Goodbye.